Well, okay, so good afternoon all. My name is Crystal Norman and I'm the Deputy Public Affairs Officer and Cultural Attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Lisbon. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the U.S. Embassy's speaker program, Mapping Currents of Freedom with the National Museum of African American History and Culture in celebration of Black History Month this year. The Smithsonian Institution is known for its eclectic buildings of 154 million items, 19 museums, 21 libraries, 9 research centers, and a zoo, which are mostly located in Washington, D.C. The National Museum of African American History and Culture is the newest of 19 museums in this world-class network. As the Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution and founding director, Lonnie G. Bunch has said, this museum tells the American story through the lens of the African American experience, and is an important call to remember all those left out of the history books. The objective of this speaker program is to highlight the significant contributions of people of African descent to American history, promote the diversity of educational and professional exchanges, and underscore the innovation and global partnerships of one of the United States' most prestigious cultural, educational, and research institutions. We hope you continue to see the U.S. Embassy in Lisbon as a true ally and partner in cultural research, outreach, and exchange. As we prioritize issues of diversity and inclusion year-round, we look forward to working side by side with local partners to facilitate substantive conversations and sustainable connections that will strengthen our long and historic U.S.-Portugal friendship for years to come. Next, I'd like to give a special thanks to the co-sponsors of this event, Associação de Afrodescendentes Jazz and AGIAC. Many thanks especially to Evelina Diaz from Jazz and Joana Cardoso from AGIAC for your continued support and commitment to the arts. Muito obrigada. Following this program, we'll be sending out an email to all registered participants with a list of opportunities ranging from studying, working, researching, and teaching in the United States. We also have some great ones for entrepreneurs, especially women. And if you're interested in grant opportunities for embassy-funded projects of mutual interest, you'll want to review that list as well. But to give you a bit more insight on how transformational an exchange program in the United States can be, and because her research interests align well with the topic of today's discussion, I've invited Dr. Aurora Santos to share her experience with the group. Her primary research interests are history, specifically decolonization, and national liberation movements. She received a scholarship through the Binational Fulbright Commission in Portugal, one of our best partners, to attend Tulane University to do a postdoc. Her research project was A Call to Action, Transnational Solidarity and the American Committee on Africa Activism Against Portuguese Colonialism. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Santos. Aurora, how are you doing today?
Thank you for introducing me.
Yes, well, so happy to have you here to share a little bit more about your experience. What would you say was the highlight of your time in the United States?
Well, I would like to say it was work, but it wasn't only work. It was also the cultural aspects of the life in New Orleans. While there, I spent a year in New Orleans. I was able to enjoy the cultural life of the city. I lived there during the period of the Mardi Gras, which was amazing for me. I was able to visit several times the Bourbon Street, that almost everybody knows, to attend to jazz sections and many gatherings with friends and co-workers from the university. So it was not only work, but also the cultural life of New Orleans. I think that it was one of the most important highlights of my stay in the city.
Oh, wow. New Orleans is a great city. I can see why you fell in love with it. What was the most important best practice you learned and professional connection you made during your exchange?
Well, my stay in New Orleans was very important to see in local how a history department in a US university works. It was very important for me because I only had experience in Portuguese universities, in Portuguese institutions. So it was very good to see other ways of working and how the department was able to carry their program and to engage with students. In terms of connections, professional connections, I was able to connect with young historians like myself from other universities in New Orleans, not only from Tulane, and we were able to organize a conference together about the United Nations and decolonization after World War II. And after I returned to Portugal, we continued to work together, so the connections continued. And last year, we published a book in a prestigious international publisher, which was very good. Yes.
Oh, that's fantastic. It's great to see how those connections made during your exchange continue to endure and lead to collaborative projects together on issues of mutual interest. That's fantastic. And lastly, how would you say that the Fulbright program has positively impacted your professional career?
Well, when I received my Fulbright grant, I was in a crossroad in my career because I finished my PhD in 2014, and it was in a period of crisis here in Portugal. So we didn't have opportunities for academia. So when I received my grant and I went to the United States it was an opportunity to continue to work as an historian. And after I returned, my Fulbright grant opened the door for a 6-year contract at my university here in Portugal, the Nova University of Lisbon. So it was a huge impact. It had a huge impact in my career.
Oh, that's fantastic. It's fantastic. I'm glad to hear that you continue to do that important research on such a timely and significant topic. So thank you so much for sharing a little bit about your experience. It was so rich, and I'm glad that you can continue to see the benefits, the investment that you made going to the United States. And so now I'd like to invite you to introduce our guest speaker for today's program.
Well, thank you. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Paul Gardulo, who is a supervisory museum curator at the prestigious Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., as well as the director of its Center for the Study of Global Slavery, where he co-leads the Slavery Records Project and In Slavery Wake Project. Since 2007, he has been part of the core team focused on building the museum's foundational collections and conceiving and crafting its inaugural exhibitions. So please join me in a warm welcome to Paul. Have the word.
Muito prazer a todas vocês. Unfortunately, my Portuguese is not as good as Dr. Santos's, but thank you very much, Aurora, for the wonderful introduction. I'm thrilled to be here with you all today. Thankful to the embassy, thankful to Jas for hosting me, and I'm excited to talk to you about the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Excited to talk to you about where we've been, but more importantly, where we're going and how our work based in the United States is connected globally to the work of centering not just the African American story, but the story of people of African descent in what I'm calling currents of freedom. And today we'll talk a little bit about that. The focus will be a bit on the museum and how we built it, and then a lot on our work in efforts that cross 4 continents, from the US to Europe to Africa to South America. So I'm going to start a slideshow for you all. I wish we were all together. And I want to begin by talking about the fact that we are at the museum, we are coming up on our 5th anniversary celebration. We will be open to the public 5 years this coming September. It is hard to believe for me. And it's a strange time to be celebrating our and commemorating our 5th anniversary year in the midst of a global pandemic. Before we close to the public, and we are closed currently to public visitors, but we have a robust online presence, and we'll talk a little bit about that process of how we navigate between being a museum that is visited by upwards of 8,000 visitors a day to a museum that is visited by approximately 5 million visitors a year online. And so I think we'll have the opportunity to talk a little bit about that, maybe answer some questions about that as well. But before we closed to the public, and because of the pandemic, in March of this past year, we had been visited by over 5 million people, with lines streaming out the door, people waiting for months to have the opportunity to gain entrance with a timed pass. We also, I should say, is that as the newest museum in the Smithsonian, we have an incredibly racially diverse audience, with the highest percentage of first-time museum visitors in the world. That is not unsubstantial to say, and I think it is rooted in our mission, and it is rooted in the kinds of ways that we tell our story, and in the practices that we use to unveil that story. We are a site of refuge, even online, of challenge, of difficult conversation, of witness, and ultimately, I argue, of reckoning for all people of all backgrounds. And so this museum, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, utilizes the best of scholarship to tell a comprehensive story of the African American experience, providing people who care about or who are interested in African American culture the possibility of exploring and reveling in this unique history. But for those of us who worked in the museum and who developed the museum from its beginnings, before we even had a site on the National Mall, we understood that this museum had to do more than that and to be more than that. For many of us, the National Museum of African American History and Culture represented the opportunity to meet the challenge of telling a more complete and more truthful American story. James Baldwin eloquently captured that sentiment in 1963 in an essay he penned the same year as the March on Washington and the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. American history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it. It would be this statement that would serve as a compass point for many of us in constructing the narratives that would comprise the museum. For us, our museum would need to demonstrate to the most diverse of audiences that one could best or only fully comprehend the complexity of American history by starting with the Black experience. Ultimately, it would be the large work of the museum to help uncover and give voice to the silences alluded to within this quote by Baldwin. And perhaps the museum's most important work in filling these silences has been in an area where we began, with our greatest lack. And you heard Crystal mention the large collection that exists at the Smithsonian, the largest museum complex in the world. Our museum, when it began without not just a building or a site, but we began without any collection. And so our work in constructing a national collection of material that speaks to this history and fills these silences was what I consider to be a process that has built what I think is a true people's museum and a national museum simultaneously. Unlike so many museums, as I mentioned, we were chartered without any collection of materials or archive. And because African American culture and existence was long devalued or undervalued, and its centrality to the national history was so long denied, especially in our national institutions like the Smithsonian. Soon after 2005, with the arrival of Director Bunch, we created a mandate to build a foundational collection from scratch that could provide evidence of and powerfully demonstrate complex interpretive themes of violence and persecution, as well as to give voice to the humanity, creativity, intelligence, resistance, and resilience that demonstrated in the face of oppression. This is what, in shorthand, we call seeing Black lives whole. And so what you're seeing now is an image of a cluster of images that are illustrating that process of collecting the objects and working with people and communities across the nation, and I will add, around the world, to begin to amass the material that shape the stories in the museum. I think a lot of questions were hurled at us doing this work. Will the material be there? Moreover, will it be embraced by people when they come to the museum? Are narratives like a narrative of slavery and freedom, one that museums have long sort of hesitated around and wondered if they were too difficult, be embraced if they were told with truth? In the words of our advisor, John Hope Franklin, with the unvarnished truth. And I'm happy to say that people are hungry for stories that are told with truth and complexity. And so what I would like to do with you now is show you a little bit of visitors' reactions to the museum. I wish I could bring you all on a tour inside the museum. In lieu of that, it's important for me as a curator to help share and give voice to the many people who we work with, and that includes the visitors themselves. And so when you're in the National Museum and you're moving through the exhibitions, the history exhibitions explicitly, that chart over 500 years of history, from the 1400s to the 21st century, tracking slavery, the story of slavery and freedom, tracking the stories of the 20th and into the 21st century, you encounter what you see here, a reflection booth, where as a visitor, you can step inside and respond to a prompt about what you're witnessing, what you're learning. And so I want to share with you about a 1.5 minute cut, especially of young people, describing what the museum experience has meant to them and how it speaks to both history and to our present moment.
Well, what I really enjoyed about the exhibit so far today is I really enjoyed learning about how slaves were the ones who really made the White House, the Capitol building. Everything that you see here in DC was made from the slaves, and that's something that I've never learned about in school.
We've all determined that schools are the most important thing. I think that all schools should come to this museum actually to really learn African American history, because they don't teach you half the stuff that's in here in schools. So I think that if everyone was exposed to this information, they would have a better outlook and understanding of where we've come from and where we are today.
It's just really informative because they don't teach this part in history.
It's usually one-sided what they teach us.
They share bits and pieces. So for us to come see this is very informational, and we get to see like our true history and our true past.
I never knew about them until I came here today. No one ever talked about it. That wasn't something they willingly brought up in history class. And to come here and realize that this young boy, my age, got shot over something so stupid, was brutally murdered. It's just something that hurts my heart.
This is one of the most comprehensive and powerful counter-narratives made available to the public that I've seen so far. That still needs to make its way to K-12 textbooks.
Because a lot of information here that's available is not taught in schools. And especially with the newer generation of young Black people, people of color, or even of different races and ethnicities, they have no idea. They have no clue about what's happened in history and how your past actions can really have an impact on modern times today.
When we first walked in, there was this one part that talked about Columbus, and like it really set into perspective like what Columbus actually did and who he actually was. And I'm like now seriously questioning why we still celebrate Columbus Day. Like, what are we doing, people? Like, let's nix that. I mean, it's great to have a day off of school, but like, let's celebrate something else.
It's a boost of confidence to know like it's not promoting Black supremacy, but it's like
Black love,
yeah,
love of
but-
ourselves,
and what we're capable of because people paved the way for us
to do. And it's like it's crazy because where we're from, it's very uncommon to see Black people love themselves and to expect great things from themselves and to help each other and lean on one another. And to see this exhibit where it's about Black history, and it's just amazing. It's just great.
It seems that everyone's letting us down.
gotta educate yourself.
Except the museum, it's lit.
People are to record.
We're not re-recording that. I'm sending that to the museum and email that to us.
So,
Well, what I really
I think you get a sense from that short snippet of mostly young people, the value I think that the museum has in reframing a national narrative and making sure that we tell deeply relevant stories and that we tell the truth. And I think that what is valuable is that people are hungry not only to take this information in, but they're carrying a lot of knowledge with them, and it needs to be respected, listened to, and shared. And I think that will be a tenor of some of the conversation and the rest of the presentation that I make, is that we view our museum as, yes, providing a new national narrative, providing the deepest of scholarship in the work we do, but marrying that with deep community engagement, understanding that not all knowledge is held in one community of academics, but that there needs to be a marriage, and that the conversation that develops in public spaces is one that can be very rich, very worthwhile, and is not something that needs to be shied away from. What I'll say is that in my current role, I can talk all day about the work we did in building the museum, and maybe we'll have another opportunity to do that. But in the role that I've been sort of shepherding as director of the Center for the Study of Global Slavery, we really want to make sure that as crucial as reframing a national narrative is, it can't be done by sacrificing the international connections, global trajectories, and diasporic histories that have shaped both African-American and American lives and history for centuries. And this meant directly addressing the sense of parochialism and isolationism that too often pervades American thinking and fails to put our history in an international context, or connects it to living and breathing communities around our nation and around the world, so that they can be included in the story as well. And that's really what I'm talking about today in terms of mapping global currents of freedom. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna give you a window in to 3 of those major initiatives that we do in the work of the center. We do work on race and incarceration, and I'll showcase that a little bit. We do 2 big international initiatives, collaborative in scope, the Slave Rex Project and the Global Curatorial Project. All of them showcase the museum as an engine for research, remembrance, reckoning, justice, and reconciliation around race. Not one of those things is important without the others. And so, in a country with the world's highest incarceration rate, where African Americans are imprisoned at 6 times the rate of white Americans, we felt it was necessary to tell this story. We tell the stories of joy, we tell the stories of cultural expression. We also need to reckon with the legacies of slavery as visited within our carceral system. And the way we did that most explicitly in the museum was collecting around a prison, the Louisiana State Penitentiary. It's one of the largest prisons in America. Doctora Santos was close to it when she was in New Orleans. It was born on a former plantation site, where literally the first camps where prisoners were held were on former slave quarters. And so it became important to us to talk about the persistence of Angola as an afterlife of slavery, as a place of Angola prison, as a place that changes, and it does change and did change and reform, but also stays the same, as a powerful testament to the continuum between slavery and incarceration. And so I began by the museum collected 2 large structures, one a guard tower, and you'll see that on the next slide, as well as a jail cell, to begin to give a powerful and large footprint to this presence in the museum. But we found that in the process of collecting and showcasing that story of a place that changes and doesn't change, we found that if we were only focused on the built environment of the carceral landscape, no matter how powerful, we were telling an incomplete story, akin to collecting and telling the story of slavery by focusing only on the instruments of restraint and control. We therefore committed to a wider collecting effort focused on those who had been imprisoned in Angola. And so you see some of that here now is we've done work collecting around the hospice program of quilters. We've done work on collecting around free press in prisons and focusing on prison programs in order to depict Angola as a complex and important world for us to pay attention to. And that world, in paying attention to that world, it led me to collecting the stories of the Angola Three, and particularly the stories of Albert Woodfox, who is a man who is held in solitary confinement wrongfully for 44 years. Person most held longest in solitary confinement in probably world history. And so what I'd like to do is in the effort to display currents of freedom as voiced by many people and from different perspectives. When Albert Woodfox was released from prison in 2016, it was just months before the museum opened. And we knew we were going to tell the stories that were showcased here, and you can see the jail cell, a 6 by 9 foot cell in the guard tower. And I arranged to collect his oral history. And here's a picture of him, and I want to play you a snippet of Mr. Woodfox's oral history that showcases how the prison system is not just a place of oppression, but is a place where people are in a daily way making ways where there seemingly is none. And so let's listen for a moment to Mr. Woodfox's voice.
The intent was to drive me insane, or hopefully to drive me to kill myself. And I had absolutely no control over anything but myself, but my mind, but my heart, my soul. And I chose to be everything different than what the state of Louisiana through the Department of Correction intended for me to be or to happen to me. You know, they controlled everything around me, but they didn't control what was inside of me. I was in control of that. And so there was this, for 40-something years, 44 years, that was this constant battle between me and the state of Louisiana through the Department of Corrections. You know, they were trying to destroy me, and I was determined to survive. I won.
I won. Right? This is a man who was held in a prison cell falsely for 44 years, 6 by 9. He's able to come through that and feel redeemed and feel like he has something to contribute. This is his current of freedom. And we feel like it's necessary to find the space and the place to convene people around these kind of testimonies, to hear them, to listen with new ears, and to, when needed, debate them, understand them more fully, and help give life to a fuller and light to a fuller American story.
The intent was to drive.
And so from Louisiana to Mozambique and Cape Town to Lisbon, we moved to thinking about our work not just in the context of the United States of America, but the way in which these histories and these currents of freedom are ones that are international in scope. And so I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk to you a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing on a large international initiative called the Slave Rights Project. The National Museum is a host of this international network, and you can see some of our global partners here: the National Park Service, the George Washington University, Aziko Museums of South Africa, Diving with a Purpose, which is an African-American group of divers who work with us. What the Slave Rights Project does is we search for the remnants of slave ships, that the ships that in some ways made the modern world, through the transatlantic slave trade, through the Indian Ocean slave trade. And we search for these ships in a way that is not just academic in scope, but it is a way that is about unveiling a history that has been hidden and submerged, and it also needs to be deeply engaged with, not by just scholars, but also by communities and people from all races to reckon with this shared history and past. The most expansive and deep way that we've done this work is through international teams working on the story of a single slave ship known as the São José Paquete de África. It's a Portuguese ship that left Lisbon in 1794 and traveled to Mozambique Island at a time when the international slave trade was shifting from the transatlantic trade to incorporate elements of the East African trade. And it was a journey that was intended to travel from Lisbon to Mozambique Island to its ultimate destination of Maranhão in Northeast Brazil. The ship wrecked instead, caught in swells and storms on the coast of South Africa, where the 512 Mozambicans who were enslaved aboard, half of whom perished, the other half of whom were saved only to be resold into slavery in the Western Cape of South Africa, which was then a Danish colony. So without going too deeply into this story, which is very resonant with, I think, our audience today, what I'd like to point you to is a brand new story map that the museum and its partners have created. This link is in the chat that outlines the many journeys of the São José. Journey that is historical, a journey that is of discovery and understanding how we know what we know the detective work of archivally locating this ship, of archaeologically locating this ship and uncovering its story, a story of heritage and personal stories of people connected to the journey, because this past is not past. It's not past, and it links us all together, from the United States to South Africa, to Mozambique, to Brazil, and to Portugal. And I think it's exciting and inspiring to see the work that Jas and others are doing to reckon with the legacies of slavery in Portugal. And I would love to figure out ways that we might be able to help help play a small part in unveiling that history and making sure we understand that this is a history that continues to shape us today. And we do not get past that history until we begin to reckon with it in real ways, right? In active ways. And this is just one way to think about it. And so with that in mind, I would like to share one of the voices, another current of freedom, another voice that we engage with. And so we work with marine archaeologists and historians, but we also work with community members and artists to make sure that those currents of freedom are expressed in all sorts of ways, through museums, but also through poetry. And here's a piece of a poem written by Diana Ferris. Diana Ferris is a South African poet. She wrote a poem called My Name is February, in honor of and in commemoration of those who lost their lives, who were enslaved aboard the São José. The poem retains its name because there was the practice within South African slavery of naming people who were enslaved after the month in which they were born. And so her family name was at one point February. And she's reclaimed that name.
My name is February. I reshaped this landscape. My hands wove the patterns of the vineyards. My feet pressed the grapes, and I was paid with the wine. I carry alcohol fetal syndrome children on my back. My name is February. I still march on the eve of December 1st when I walk the cobblestones of the city and cry out in desperation, remember the emancipation of the slaves. My name is February. 200 years after the São José, I was given the vote. They said I was free. But don't you see how often I am submerged, way down? I'm the sunken, the soiled, forgotten, and yet memory will not leave me. My name is February, stranded at Third Beach, but no one comes to look for me. No one waves from the dunes. No bridges back to Mozambique. My name is February. I shall be resurrected, brought to the surface, unshackled, unchained, unashamed. My name is February.
So the stories of
My name is
the stories of the São José are not just rooted in South Africa. They connect us across geography and across history, from the present to the past. And they connected us where our work continues to go on, not just in Cape Town, looking for the descendants, perhaps descendant communities connected to that history, to unlock a broader history of Mozambican presence in South Africa, but they connect us to Mozambique itself, where we're continuing to do work that is preserving the submerged environment around Mozambique Island, that we are collecting oral histories, doing archaeological work, and training people who are local to the island to steward that history, especially underwater. And so what you see here is a soil ceremony where we had traveled from Mozambique Island to Cape Town to deposit soil from perhaps the last footfall of people who had boarded the São José on a little village called Mossoril, close to Mozambique Island. And we received this soil in this cowrie shell basket with a charge to tell our ancestors that their people are still being cared for by those of us here who are standing here today. Senor Nogash gave us this soil and this sacred charge, and we continue to stay in touch with him and to make sure that those connections are not a one-day memorial, but are a living and breathing aspect of the work that we continue to do. And so that work continues not just in the Slave Rex Project around the São José. We do this work in Senegal. We do this work in St. Croix. We do this work in the United States. But we also take this work seriously, not just in the stories of the slave trade, but in building a large exhibition with partners from around the world called In Slavery's Wake. And this is the second global initiative that the museum co-hosts with our partner at Brown University and a series of partners across Europe, Africa, and South America. We believe that through exhibition and collecting and publication, this project known as In Slavery's Wake will collaboratively assemble a shared global narrative to increase public understanding of how slavery and freedom connect us. In the Americas, Africa, and Europe, race-based slavery and the global slave trade inaugurated the modern moment and created the foundation of empire, colonialism, race, and global capitalism. As such, this story, and not just its story of slavery and emancipation, but its afterlives, is deeply interwoven into our current institutions, cultures, and beliefs on a global, national, and local level. And so our attempt is to create an exhibitionary, a traveling exhibition that will move to 4 continents, to sites on 4 continents, and be met and embraced by local exhibitions that are hosted to tell a local story of how slavery and freedom made that place. We believe that it's this kind of work in navigating the terrain between the local and the global where we'll begin to really break new ground to tell stories that are meaningful to all people. And so it is in efforts like this that I think we need to see our work. And I just want to showcase some of that with my remaining time. I want to be careful to not go over time because I want to have plenty of time for our moments, but I'd like to show you at least one of the aspects of the program we do. In Slavery's Wake, we feel like it's crucial to not just to bring new stories into the archive, much like we did with the museum efforts. Part of that means talking to people and bringing new conversations into common parlance with each other. And so here is some conversations. And so we began an unfinished conversation series where we partner with local institutions in places like Rio, and you'll see a series of them, to begin to talk more publicly with activists, with artists, with scholars, with curators, with everyday folks about how to tell more honest stories of slavery and freedom in these places and spaces. And so here is a little bit, I'll play one of 2 videos here, short videos from Rio and our day working.
Angola quem me criou. Eu só fui de Moçambique, ai meu Deus do céu, eu sou negro, sim senhor. espero um dia poder conhecer Moçambique e que vocês também venham conhecer a gente aqui no Brasil. Um abraço.
So this was at the end of a day where we had convened about 36 people in the National Historical Museum in Rio to talk about this project. And this is Fatinha and her sister. They are the leaders of a Jongo community in Rio that traces its roots to Mozambique. And so we wanted to capture a short message that they could send to our friends and colleagues in Mozambique. Similarly, here's a poet from who works with Ipe Afro. It's a Afro-Brazilian cultural, historical, political organization. And this is their Milso Santos, who had just created a poem on systemic and structural racism. And I'll play just a bit of it for you.
Pode começar? Racismo é a prática mais genocida de todos os tempos. Fato. Cumprindo seu maior objetivo, segue invisibilizando o povo preto de África, a diáspora, num número incalculável. Por isso, na hora do feio, do odiável, do tenebroso, do rejeitável, do fudido, do desgraçado, em primeiro, se não único lugar, vem desenhado o negro, em nosso pensamento enquanto colonizado. Vejam o que os europeus fizeram com os nativos, exterminaram os índios, destruíram as tribos, sim, vejam diariamente, preto favela contra preto favela contra preto fardado. E tem gente da gente que só porque está estudando numa universidade ou acessou um cargo na prefeitura ou no estado, já não coloca mais os pés na favela, fica na primeira pessoa do singular, posando de intelectual diferenciado. Enquanto a mídia faz piadas, funerárias vendem, floriculturas vendem e nossas mães prosseguem enterrando seus filhos, nossos irmãos assassinados. Se for gordo e tiver a identidade sexual que não seja hétero, sofre. Se for gordo, tiver a identidade sexual que não seja hétero e for negro, sofre dobrado. Se for mulher, o machismo agride. Se essa mulher for negra, o machismo junta seu sexismo com o suporte do racismo e faz com que essa mulher sofra seu bocado. Racismo é estruturante e, sobretudo, é extremamente estruturado. Apesar de nossas conquistas, a palavra denegrir segue o mesmo sentido no dicionário, que significa tornar mais negro, que é igual a manchar a reputação. É negona, é negão. Racismo não dá intervalo. A corda ainda só quebra do lado mais afro. Racismo é um problema de todos, seja alvo ou privilegiado, porque racismo provocador, dor que produz revolta, revolta que forma indignados, indignados cada vez mais estratégicos, estratégicos cada vez mais articulados, articulados cada vez mais Xangô, Xangô cada vez mais Machado. Justiça seja feita nesse acerto de contas inevitável, eu desejo o menor dos estragos. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado.
Pode começar?
So I think it's important that we think about and listen to these voices and create brave spaces. Again, much like for Albert Woodfox, creating the space to listen, to learn, to debate, to convene. Okay? This is the work of unfinished conversations that we do. And we do it in Rio, we do it in Liverpool, and as you'll see in a moment in Glasgow. We bring people together and we not only ask them to express themselves, but we come to common ground around a table where we begin to think about what could and what should an exhibition look like if it were going to come to Liverpool. And so you see here this display of visual notes that we found to be very useful in talking about giving voice to people, how we can talk about how Liverpool was built on the slave trade, but how the community needs to come together in a common knowledge and have public and common conversation. Similarly, we did this in Glasgow. where we brought people together, and you can see the group who was participating in this conversation, talking about the power in this place and what is our common understanding of freedom. This is what you would see at the beginning of a conversation that would then develop over time, where the community members would begin to pick up and work with curators to tell to find the necessary stories for reckoning, for healing. And that work continues in Senegal, which is where we're recently doing this work. It also entails collecting oral histories from people who had been descended from those who were enslaved, and creating new artistic pieces, whether they're poems, and on the right you see a song being sung by telling a history of the people who had never been told before, who had been formerly enslaved. And on the left, you see a rendering that we commissioned from a new artist. It's not a yet, it's a study of a historical woman who led people to freedom in the former capital of Saint Louis in northern Senegal, who has been forgotten except in oral history. And so we're helping to give her a presence and a vision and a voice through collecting oral histories. So this is the work of unfinished conversations. This is what we talk about when we're talking about living in slavery's wake. And I truly believe that is with efforts like this, all bent on expanding the archive, where I began at the beginning, asserting and giving voice to new narratives to build a new historical consciousness among publics. Really a whole-scale reassessment of our work and purpose in public and cultural institutions, be they museums, be they archives, be they universities. This is the great work that we need to engage in collectively around the world, remaking meaning as museums remake themselves, even during COVID. So in closing, let me make a charge to you all that it is the labor that we do in fostering and protecting and sharing these collections, in filling the silences, in telling these stories and putting our strength into working in concert with each other, sometimes in critique and sometimes in heated debate, sometimes painful and sometimes joyful, but always in the spirit of life, struggle, freedom, and equality. That matters, because change can happen when that happens, when we truly bring ourselves to it. Infused with that spirit, our institutions, our museums, our libraries, our works are more than just shrines full of static artifacts, shards, or sheaths of paper, but they become places with the potential to be genuine, transformative forces for truth-telling, for healing, for reconciliation, and for transformation. People are waiting for it, and we have the responsibility to help them find it and find their pathways within the currents of freedom. And so with that, let me thank you, and let's move on to some questions. And if we have some time, I would love to show you pieces of another video that I have of visitors to the museum. But I really am eager to hear your voices at this point. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gardullo. That was an incredible presentation. Such significant discoveries, revelations. And you mentioned the brave work of unfinished conversations and a new historical consciousness. That really, I know, resonated with a lot of the practitioners in this room. I would like to invite everyone who may have a question for Dr. Gardullo to share that in the chat. I'll be taking those questions and posing it to him. But we want to continue this conversation. As you said, you've given us so much to think about. And it's really great to see that this work is being done not only in the United States, but around the world with our global partners. I wanted to start off with a question while we wait for people to gather their thoughts. What was the most, in your work as museum curator for, like you said, one of the most prestigious museums in one of the largest collections in the world, What was the most memorable experience you've had working with the National Museum of African American History and Culture?
There are so many experiences that it's hard to pick one. I was there beginning to do work. I helped collect the Tuskegee Airman's airplane, and we brought it across country, and on its path of donation, we had it flown across country, and I was able to fly in the plane above Tuskegee University, where it trained African-American pilots, where they were trained rather. And while I was there, the pilot who was flying the plane, who was donating the plane to the museum, asked me to take the stick and fly it. And when I did that, I felt, he said, you need to know this as the curator, you need to know what this feels like. And for me, that once I stopped freaking out and I understood the weight of what I was doing, not just physically, because when I turned around and I'd been holding the stick, he was holding his hands up to let me know that I was in control. But flying over that university and feeling the history of those men who held onto that very stick, and sort of showcasing a patriotism that their own country wasn't showing to them at the time, the full weight of our responsibility fell on my shoulders. The responsibility that we have to steward this history properly, to tell this history authentically and with passion and compassion and empathy and truth. So, but there are many instances like that. And those are the things that will live with me forever. And they are also the things that keep me up at night, because it's a big responsibility.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what would you say is, something that excites you about the projects and the partnerships you have coming up?
I'm excited. I'm excited to get back out in the world.
Yeah.
I was in Senegal in March of 2020, and we had to leave and rush home. We were getting prepared to organize our oral history filming with our partners at IFAN Museum in Dakar. And I met and grown to love so many of our partners around the world. And I'm so excited to do this work with them and to continue to learn from them. And that is fundamental to help to always showcase, is that the work we do, even as the National Museum of African American History and Culture, even as one of the preeminent museums in the world, isn't work that is, let us show you how to do it. It is true collaborative effort where we are learning and growing as much as we are helping to participate and put our shoulders to the wheel and show what we can do. And that's the coolest, most exciting part of what I do.
Yeah. So what was your last event that you actually did in person before the pandemic hit?
That was it. I've been home working remotely since last March. There's been wonderful work to be done. We've got to do our institution building. We've learned ways to communicate globally and virtually in new ways, and that's cool. But that was it. I had to get rushed home from Dakar in March, and right when we were understanding that the airports were being closed.
Right. So we'd love to hear from the practitioners in the chat. I know that we have a lot of different strong cultural institutions all over Portugal represented here. It's great to see so much interest in the Smithsonian and the work that it's doing. And there is even some talk about someone sharing their interest in learning more and even collaborating. So those are the types of connections that we'd love to kind of foster and continue to foster through these types of speaker programs. What is one thing that you say that you would if you had the opportunity to visit Portugal, what is something that you're kind of more interested in learning about here?
Well, I think I'm really interested in the current work that's going on Portugal's history and its involvement in the slave trade, and understanding that this is such a crucial part of this proud seafaring nation's history, and it has not been told, and it needs to be told in its full complexity and with a full understanding of the African presence in Portugal. And I think that much like we intend to center the African American experience in America, I would love to see, and I'm excited about the similar kind of work there. I think it's so crucial. I think it's relevant not only to history as a backward glance, but to understanding where we are in the world today, with issues of migration, with issues of, quite honestly, the re-rise of racism and white supremacy. We need to understand the rootedness of this history. We need to understand this is a shared history, and that it is not just a history of pain, but it's an incredible history of resilience, an incredible history of cultural contribution, and it's an incredible history that we can use as a wellspring to draw from. That history of people who had been enslaved. It's vitally important to our world today to showcase this.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so great. Thank you. We have one question in the chat. It says, first of all, thank you so much for the presentation. In Portugal, in my opinion, we have serious difficulties in dealing with the country's colonial past. You mentioned several times that the museum started with no collection whatsoever. So I'd like to know, what were the biggest challenges, political and material, to starting a curatorial project like this? And what about the sponsorship or the ownership debate?
Okay, that's a great question. Wonderful question from Sophia. I have to ask for clarification about what the ownership debate is, so we can come back to that. But the challenges politically were vast in the United States. This museum had been proposed by African American veterans of the US Civil War in 1915. We opened the museum, as you heard, in 2016. It was a 100-year journey. Much of that journey was a political one, in manifesting the power, the political power, the social capital, the economic power to realize this work. Big story, long story, one really worth delving into, but I think the other piece of it was that this was actively part of the political debate. Mm-hmm. Was one where people who did not want to see this history centralized on the National Mall, one of their prime excuses within the US Senate was to say, well, there's no history there. There's no objects, right? Maybe there's sports material that you can show. Maybe you can show some musical instruments, but that's it. I mean, the resistance to embracing a full story was, you mentioned the resistance to that within Portugal. It was in the United States too. Mm-hmm. And so it became fundamental, a raison d'etre, right, for the museum to demonstrate that the material exists. The material is there, it's out in the landscape, and we need to amass that and assemble it. And that's a political statement to make, to say there's a collection. The way we did it was, one of the ways we did it was doing a massive version of an Antiques Roadshow that was conceived by our director, Lonnie Bunch, who said, what's essential here is we need to we have a belief that the history is out on the landscape. It hasn't been recognized. If we create a program where we travel the country, much like those shows where people are assessing the monetary value of the things they have in their home, but what we're not going to do is assess their monetary value. We'll ask people to bring their materials out, and we'll talk to them about the histories. And we're not going to collect everything. But what we're going to do is showcase the value of this history to the American public. Sometimes people keep that material in their homes. Sometimes they may donate it to their local historical society or museum. Every once in a while, something of national importance will come to the National Museum. And so that effort, that didn't just say, we're here to get and grab everything, but here to say, we're here to value history and help you value it, was an essential tool. And it raised consciousness and awareness and actually helped build the collection.
Oh, great, great. I wanted to take a moment to recognize an important partner for the U.S. Embassy in Portugal, the Bilateral Fulbright Commission in Portugal, headed by Executive Director Otília Reis. Dr. Reis, Otília Reis is in the room and shares her positive feedback and congratulations on your presentation, Dr. Gardullo. And she said she had the privilege of visiting the museum, and it was a very impactful experience as a Portuguese person. And she would love to see the Fulbright Portugal, the commission here collaborating with the Smithsonian. So I hope we can kind of continue that conversation. And many people echo her thoughts about collaborative work with some of the institutions that are promoting educational research and exchange here in Portugal. Someone mentioned in Lisbon, there is a strong discussion about setting up the Museum of Slavery. Finally, the option was to set up a memorial as collections are scattered among many institutions. Do you have any views on, these types of, projects and moving forward, and how you might be able to kind of celebrate the different interests of various organizations who want to empower marginalized voices and capture these important moments in history?
I think there's no one solution. There's no one magic bullet. I think what you need to do is continue the work that I see organizations like JAS doing, which is making sure that there's connections to established cultural institutions, that even at the same time as something is coming new that online, that you're manifesting political will, right? And you're listening and you're understanding the ways in which constituencies can be built to manifest this story, be it in a new museum, be it in transforming existing museums, be it in something else. I mean, I think that the key is creating the conditions to help people understand that this history is necessary to tell, that it is a shared history that we all have to, that belongs to all of us, and we have to reckon with it. And that it is, and we can look to models in the United States, but elsewhere in the world, that people are hungry for this kind of history and this kind of movement to take place. It's not something we should hide our head in the sands about. It's not something that we should hide from. And it's something that when embraced, you can see the value of, about as those young people in the video said, showcasing this story is showcasing Black love. That is one of the most powerful comments I've heard, and I've heard it time and again. I've taken people through the museum, and one woman who was a head of a historically Black college in the United States said, Paul, I came into this, I was giving them a tour, and she's like, I came into the museum and I thought I was going to find a museum of white guilt, and I found a museum of Black love. And I think if we think of ourselves and our work in those terms, we're in good shape, because it's embracing, it's telling the truth, but it's recognizing what the value of this work is and what its goal is, right? So that's my quick answer. But you're asking complex, these are great questions, but they're hard, you guys.
No, they're not my questions. Great questions from the participants. You mentioned young people, and I that quote from from the young person in the video also stood out to me. We do have some young people in the room that are curious, what is your advice to young people who want to get involved in doing this work and sharing these important stories?
Be brave, take chances, do your homework, understand that this world is a place where there are many, many opinions. Make sure that when you're forming your opinions, that you've done the homework to establish them. That, right? So combine your resources, right? If you're focused on telling stories that you haven't seen in the world, then you need to look to the archives. You need to look to people who have done work, but you also need to look to, just like we've done, expand the archive. Talk to people who own that history and get to know it better. Sometimes the history is found, if it's not found in the official places and spaces, it's found in the world right beneath your feet and right around yourself. And so take that knowledge and build upon it. That's the best advice I can give. I think it's vitally important to make sure that we don't devalue our own knowledge and stories.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. And there are many people in the chat that have talked about how much more there is to learn about the slave trade, how much more there is to learn about these stories, these untold stories, these forgotten stories. Where would you like to see the field in terms of research, in terms of representation in 5 to 10 years on these types of issues?
I see there's so much work going on. As the director for the Center of Study of Global Slavery, right? I see this moment in terms of looking at the history and the legacies of slavery. We're at a moment of sea change, right? Globally. And I think looking at that history with more complexity than it ever has before, doing that work of connecting the local to the global, moving outside of our national boundaries to do that work, while respecting local communities, that's the work. And we're going to see, and I think we're going to see a sea change in that, and I hope, and we have to keep pushing for that. Because I think until we begin to honestly grapple with this past, we're going to keep revisiting our same problems. It's not the only solution, but doing this kind of work and doing this kind of work outside of the boundaries purely of academia is where it needs to happen. It's where the conversations need to go. It's where change is going to be made.
Great. And there are some comments about starting oral histories here in Portugal. And I think during the pandemic, many of us are thinking about how we can tell those stories. There's so much loss globally, family members, friends. I've found myself looking at family recipes, trying to track down bits and pieces of my own history, just so I have the full story to share, with other members of my family and, my kids in the future. So what advice would you give to people who are looking to start at home when it comes to preserving their history and making sure these stories are passed on?
That's a great question. It's absolutely essential. You don't need to rely on a big museum in America to do this work, right? I mean, I think what's crucial, although what you can do is go to the museum's website. We have an oral historian on our staff and an oral history program. And I know that I don't think it's up right now, but I believe that she is working on a kind of a kit for people to be able to do that kind of a work in their homes for themselves. And so I'll look into that and see if I can share a link or at least have a timeline for when that might happen. There's so many online resources that the museum has. They're all predominantly in English. We need to be better at globalizing. But there's a whole race portal that we have for people to engage in questions of race and racism and creating brave spaces to talk about things. it's primarily done within an American context. And so that's part of the why we do the work we do, is like understanding that the histories of race are global, and we need to begin to expand upon and continue to learn as a museum. But check those things out, and I'll get back to you on that. But this notion of creating oral histories, creating that something like unfinished conversations, is something that, you know, is possible and is fruitful. And, you know, I think if we can't come in and do work directly with you, we can try to figure out ways that our network and our partners can interface. And that's part of the great work too, is understanding that we don't hold all the solutions. A part of the work we do is in convening and connecting.
Absolutely, such great thoughts. Someone had a clarifying question about ownership. I know we touched on that a little bit earlier. They wanted to clarify that they were asking me about the challenges in collecting materials from other countries relating to the ownership of these objects. Since it's an American museum, did you face any challenges during that process?
Yeah, certainly there is one of the benefits to the work we did was that we were creating a new collection, and we collected materials in, I think, a different way than museums have typically done so. We've done so in a way that honored and respected the donors, and you heard a little bit about it. And so I think that the work of my museum, as opposed to the work of the way that the other museums have created their collections, including the Smithsonian, right, is a bit different, and we model something new. Now, that said, we are in a world where, as Dr. Santos knows, and we talked about, is a world of where we're talking about decolonization, where we're talking about repatriation, where we're talking about this. So now I understand what you mean by ownership. Those conversations are crucial, and we need to engage in them. And so what I would say there's no, like the other conversation, there's no one simple solution. Part of it is about institutions repatriating materials. Part of it is about helping to transform institutions that are holding materials to be decolonized, in a sense, to be transformative and think about their collections and the way they treat those and care for those collections. Part of it is about investing in institutions in places where collections were stolen from, quite frankly, right? And so it's a big, complex problem, but it is one that is going to be essential to the museum world. Inclusive in this process is this notion that we need to develop about shared stewardship, and the idea that, and this is what we do with our work on unfinished conversations, when we are thinking about collecting materials, and in this case it's oral histories, we're not interested in we're interested in digitizing collections and sharing the original materials with the people who own that history, and keeping copies of it for use in museums and museum collections. And so that is one technique. But I think there's a constellation of what I would call, let's call them restorative practices that amount to a broader ethos of restorative justice. And that's a big topic. It's huge, and it's another whole session. So, but it's deeply valuable.
And just to wrap up, as I know there are many people who may have Washington, D.C. on their next trip to the United States when conditions allow, if they are able to stop by and visit the National Museum of African American History and Culture, what is one or two exhibits that you really think they can't miss during that visit to the museum? I know, it's so hard to boil down. But we hope when conditions allow, everyone here will be able to visit and see in person the richness of this collection. So
Yes.
which places can't they miss?
Well, I think if you've got people, first of all, people come and spend a day in the museum and we'll spend a whole day in one exhibition. The good news is it's good enough that you're going to be rich, have a rich experience wherever you go. Most people who come to the museum go straight down to the underground portion where the history story is. And they take that journey, that historical journey that begins in the 15th century and moves to the 21st century. But we have an exhibition called Musical Crossroads at the top of our museum that celebrates music and cultural expression, and it's next to our visual arts gallery. And going into the museum, people oftentimes go there after they take in all the history as a sort of a redemptive kind of moment, as a moment of light and healing. You can't go wrong. There's so many moments within the museum that you feel the power of that story. And I think that's what's important, is the museum is invested from the very small, and you can get it just by looking at a single object, a tin that contained a man named Joseph Trammell's Freedom Papers from the 1850s that his family kept for generations until they gave it to us to entrust. You can find a full experience in what seems like a single empty tin. And then you look around you and multiply that by 10,000. And then you understand that this museum is doing something different. This museum has the potential to change you if you let it.
Oh, wonderful. Well, what a positive note to end on. Dr. Gardullo, on behalf of the U.S. Embassy in Lisbon and our co-sponsors, Jazz and Asiac, I would like to thank you so much for your participation in the U.S. Embassy Speaker Program, Mapping Currents of Freedom with the National Museum of African American History and Culture. This has been a wonderful and rich discussion. I'm sure everybody will go straight to the website and look at some of those exhibits you've mentioned and some of the materials and projects that you continue to work on. Many thanks to you and your team for all of this important work. And we look forward to trying to create more sustainable connections and significant conversations with our local partners here in Portugal. So thank you so much again. Thank you all for coming, for your participation, your time and energy and interest in arts, education, and culture. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Crystal.